So, yes, I have changed the title of this session. I'm going to talk about institutional background and historical background in the restoration policy and ecological continuity. So you're going to hear about the institutions, the policies around ecological continuity, very much related to what Régis Barrault explained. I am doing my thesis on this topic, funded by the Water Agency in Aquitaine and another region in France. So my thesis started by looking at the investments. We noticed that there is a growing investment by public authorities to restore aquatic environments in a lot of countries. In France, the restoration of ecological continuity is one of the priorities to achieve an optimized ecological status. However, we see barriers, social, political barriers, and I'm going to tell you more about these social political barriers in a minute. And what I want to present here is the fact that these obstacles depend on institutional background and historical background in each country. They show different directions, different ways to achieve the restoration policy. So how are these projects different? There are several ways to conceptualize restoration, to define restoration. During one of the workshops yesterday afternoon, we had to try and find solutions with practical cases to achieve ecological continuity. We often ended up saying, it depends in the priorities. How do you prioritize biological priorities, ecological priorities, and social economical stakes? So the idea in the institutional approach is that to say that there is a first framework with international agreements, the European Union agreements with the Water Framework Directive, and there is a national framework with the LEMA law, the Ecological Corridors publication. That's giving a framework, already a definition of ecological continuity in France. So we had to discuss the prioritization, as in what's the object already, what are we restoring? Do we favor hydraulic continuity, or is it more of a bio-centered strategy for fish species? Is it eco-centered more generally speaking? Is it integrated, as in which means do we prioritize? We can talk about restoration, rehabilitation, renaturalization, which we see in Switzerland a lot, to create more wild areas. And the last way to prioritize would be objectives. Do we want to protect? Do we want to preserve? Do we want to use, exploit, or improve? So what we see is different conflicting objectives which are wider. We want sometimes to put things into the heritage. So it could be the rivers, the landscapes. We have migration, fishes, which are very significant and part of our heritage. The salmons So what do we want to identify as heritage? The works themselves, the dams themselves, their territory, the river? Is it a natural heritage, cultural, productive heritage? All of these elements are included. And we need to think about the policies, again, identifying as heritage the policies, giving all the space to the stakeholders to negotiate, renegotiate regulations locally using contracts. I will tell you a few words about the case I am using in this presentation. It is Ciron in the Aquitaine region. Ciron is a river going into the Garonne, going through 3 departments. There is the Ciron watershed, and at department level, there is an ecological continuity project for rivers without watersheds, and it's the fisheries departmental authority who is in charge of that. So we have a water commission. I'm going to talk to you mostly about the Ciron watershed. So there is a water commission looking after it for about 10 years. And on the Ciron, there are 20 mostly mills weirs, 4 which should be completely removed, a few partly removed, and a few will be equipped with crossing pathways. So the Ciron represents 1,311 square kilometers, the Ciron watershed. So of course we talk about transversal and lateral works to manage flood risk. The slope is quite low, so the hydropower potential is quite low as well. There are overall 70 pieces of work on the river, 40 are out of use, 20 are priorities. As I said, there are issues in fishes crossing and silting, a lot of sand in some areas. This watershed is classified as Natura 2000. There are a lot of fish species preservation issues with eels, lampreys, sea trouts, crayfish. And the main stakeholders around this project are the fish breeders, the fish farmers are usually agreeing with the improvement of the watershed. They usually don't mind having a dam upstream, so the migrating fishes won't bring diseases back. The silviculturists usually like having this watershed as well to avoid forest fires in the area. The wine growers also think that restoration of ecological continuity is a good thing to certify natural strategy in the region, which would add a good name to their wine. But the watershed, of course, the water retention is important to irrigate the vineyards. And as we said with Mr. Barrault, there are budgets allocated sometimes. Where is a limit between the local territory and there is a budget on either sides. And of course, you have to deal with the mills owners and the officials. Officials who have an opinion and usually are willing to push forward the ecological continuity strategy. So we created SAGE in 2014 to work on the river strategy, to work on fish crossing, and to work on ecological continuity for the canoe activity as well. It wasn't called ecological continuity before we created the SAGE working group in 2014, but there already was a strategy which started.
I'd like to come back on my hypothesis. I've said that it was an institutional approach to understand restoration policies and the difficulties to implement it. In political sciences, we have got different regulations, procedures, and we also have cognitive tools with ideas, benchmarks for the management of rivers. It is linked to ecological engineering in France with symbols, representations, and storytelling. Institutions translate interest, different ideas which are in international conventions. I mentioned that earlier. We have got a lot of them since 40 years in favor of fish science for the rights of the water, built heritage, and all these institutions translate interests and values and so on. With mandatory objectives, like on the Ciron, as I said, you have got practices of ecological continuity with a more structured approach. Individuals shape mainly and actively institutions. We know, historically speaking, that the fact that the mills are not used anymore, well, we are losing know-how, and when these processes stop, institutions are getting more fragile. It is the same for the water police. As we said before, with regulations which exist for a long time already, but the water police until now was not concerned about it that much. And the ecological continuity was not on the agenda. And we didn't have a funding aspect. So we have got determinisms from part of institutions on public action and negotiations in the politic field from part of individuals. So we can see that with the implementation of public policies, and we can see policy negotiations, so with regulatory aspects, and thanks to SAGE or other contracts for basins, all these devices with different actors, well, we can readjust the regulations. For example, in the SAGE Ciron, most of the time, the classification of the rivers were under or sub-estimated. and the actors revised some priorities. It went quite well because we have got institutional public actors which are quite important. With all that, we have got differences of implementation in politics for ecological continuity. For the institutions, well, you have got two paintings, well, one painting and a sculpture, Umberto Boccioni. So he was a painter and a sculptor, so institutions are not fixed organisms, and it depends on who is creating them, and it is difficult to agree on what which institution is doing. It is the same thing with art. Institutional change, a few words about that as well. All that to tell you that these policies of ecological continuity is shaped by institutions which establish frameworks and orientate the policies, articulations of instruments. You also have to take into consideration the dependencies. We also have endogenous and exogenous factors with international conventions. And of course, other external factors outside of biodiversity with the production of renewable energies. And endogenous factors, so legitimation to solve a public problem, covering the discussion space with other actors. And we are not in a situation of monopoly. It also depends of legitimacy of institutions, and in the case of ecological restoration, it is done thanks to visibility of the processes. Especially on the Ciron, we have seen that some owners, they didn't want to restore, but in the end they accepted after having seen some other projects. We also talked about visibility for migratory species like salmons. So they go out of the water, so they're visible. With all that, we have storytelling, and we can have the support of institutions and the public organisms. We also have moments of continuity and institutional changes. We try to talk about that with Régis Barrault, and to see to which extent this ecological continuity is a marginal or a very significant change, or in the end we already have institutions and they are reactivated or updated. It is the case for the reclassification of the rivers with the law ALEMA. Sometimes it's not used and others are reactivated, and institutions work like that. So the question of the changes and the politics trajectory is even more important today, because we are in favor of hydropower, but we don't know what will happen with this policy. Two hypotheses. After having analyzed the processes of public action, we can have a look at the consequences. So, governance modes, what does it encompasses? So, with certain actors and utilization and then large participation with a collectivization of the rivers, governance with regulations and standardizations. And on the other side, a governance with contracts at the local level with the tools that I mentioned earlier. So we have got differentiation processes and the territories work with their own institutions and interests, and the implementation are very different from one territory to another in one same country, but at the European or international level as well. Thank you for your attention.